Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Terri Crawford, Public Policy Director for the League of Women Voters, and your host for today's program. Today we're going to discuss the proposed constitutional amendment to the Nebraska Constitution, which will restrict voting rights. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, and we do not support political candidates, and we do not support political parties. We do, however, will take a position on issues such as voting rights. Now, our purpose is to empower voters and to defend democracy. And it is our hope that as a result of these discussions, that you as the voter will feel empowered each time you go to the voting booth during the election cycle. Now, Go Vote Omaha, it is our primary focus to discuss issues that are important to the voters in the community. Today we are joined by Brad Christian-Sallis. Brad is the field director for Civic Nebraska. Civic Nebraska is a lead organization of a coalition of nonprofit organizations, including the League of Women Voters and the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, who oppose this amendment. So thanks, Brad, for being here with us today. Why don't we go ahead and get into the questions? So in Nebraska, we have seen this approach before. In recent days, there have been petition workers who are paid, who are out collecting signatures and asking individuals to sign this petition regarding this constitutional amendment. We've seen it before in the legislature. Talk some about why now this is coming in the form of a constitutional amendment.
Well, the big reason it's coming in the form of a constitutional amendment now is because we have some great legislators up there in our Nebraska unicameral. So any type of voter ID bills we've been able to stop through advocating, and groups like Civic Nebraska and the League reaching out to those legislatures and saying, hey, this is not a policy that's good for Nebraskans, and they've listened to us. So the workaround when the legislature isn't able to get something done is to take it to the ballot. A lot of times, most of us, we don't have enough money to really pay signature collectors, to be out in different places collecting enough signatures to get something on the ballot, but some people have enough money to do that. So that's kind of why this approach has been taken instead of it going through the legislature.
Okay. So what does the Nebraska Constitution currently say about voting?
So our Constitution has some really great, strong protections for voting. It says there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of the qualified voter to use the elective franchise. So what that means is that things like voter ID, anything that would be a restriction on the voter, like this would be, it's not allowed. So the only way to get something like that in is to actually change our state constitution, because our state constitution was created to protect our right to vote.
Okay. So that everyone is clear on how voting works in Nebraska, isn't there already identification when you register to vote in Nebraska?
Yes, there is. So when you go to register to vote, if you're doing it online, they'll ask you to put in your driver's license number, or if you're filling out a paper voter registration, you'll have to put down your driver's license number or the last four of your social security number, so that we are able to check and confirm, yes, this person is a citizen, they're 18, and they're eligible to vote. So we already have that process of making sure our people who are voting are supposed to be voting. What this amendment does is add an additional restriction that just makes it harder for people to be able to cast their ballot.
Okay. Now, we had a similar issue in Nebraska several years ago regarding the affirmative action type of initiative. There was a petition drive at that time. Some of the language was very, in my opinion, deceiving to the voter. So now let's talk about the language in this new proposed constitutional amendment, what that looks like, and the vague nature of that language in this new proposed amendment.
Definitely. So this new proposed amendment, it's very clear what it's meant to do, but how it would do it is where the vagueness really occurs. I don't have it right in front of me, but it essentially says that before any election, a voter will show a photo ID before casting a ballot. But that vagueness causes a lot of problems because you think about things like voting by mail. That's something where how do you show that before you vote by mail? Are you, making a photocopy of your ID and sending it in with your ballot to vote by mail? How does that process work? The other thing is it doesn't specify at all what type of photo ID someone would need. So in most cases, in most other states, what we've seen is a lot of common forms of ID, like student IDs and military IDs, don't end up counting because of the rules that get put on it in the legislature.
Okay. And that would have been my next question to you, because this is going to affect a large demographic of individuals, particularly those that are already vulnerable or marginalized. So there's no real language that determines what particular ID is going to count. Is that right?
No, it's just ID with a photo and an address. And a lot of IDs don't have that address, or they don't have a photo. So for instance, we think about our Social Security card. That's something you can use for almost anything. Your birth certificate you can use for almost anything. Well, those don't have addresses in most cases, and they don't have photos. So those are two forms of ID that a lot of people would have that would only be a step towards getting the proper ID to vote.
Okay. So what happens if the Nebraska legislature can't decide how to implement the amendment, or it just keeps getting filibustered? What happens?
What would happen then is really, there's a lot of confusion around it, but what we think could potentially happen is that the rules would still be made, but they would be made on a county by county level. So what you could see is each county in Nebraska basically having its own process for how identification is shown and how that voter restriction is enforced. With all types of different, everything we talked about, just with what the legislature would decide, would end up getting decided on a county by county level.
Which has the potential to create a lot of confusion around voting.
A lot. And can you imagine that being the case and then having to, move during an election and figuring out a whole new process, and what worked in Omaha wouldn't work in Lincoln, and it could get very, very confusing.
Okay. So what about the costs to Nebraskans for implementing this type of process, should it pass?
So what we've seen in the past, when a similar bill has gone through the legislature, usually cost-wise, it costs about $3 million to start up for that first year, and that includes like helping to provide IDs, helping get all the systems that would need to be set up just to run it. And then after that, it usually costs about $1 million a year to maintain. So it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that could be spent on things that would be a lot better for our community, a lot of money that could address real problems we have instead of a non-existent problem.
Okay, and that's probably one of those hidden costs that's not discussed at all by those that are gathering signatures for this amendment. Is there any discussion at all, do you believe, or anything in the language that would let the average Nebraskan know that this is the cost of such an amendment?
No, there's not, and that's part of the reason why it is introduced as an amendment to the Constitution, but says the legislature will handle it, because then you don't have to talk about the cost of it, because that'll come later.
Okay. So you mentioned vote by mail. Vote by mail has become very popular in this state and many other states. How would this affect vote by mail across the board?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it could be a situation where people need to mail in a copy of their ID with their vote by mail ballot. It could be a situation where, before you get your vote by mail ballot, you need to go into the election commissioner and present your physical ID. There's no answer to that. The one question that I think about a lot is, what about our counties that are already doing all vote by mail elections? How does this affect them versus counties that are doing some by mail, and then some people are still going to the polling place? It really opens up a lot of confusion into our election system, especially when we don't have all counties doing the same thing, where some are just totally by mail right now.
Okay. So what about when people vote in person? What kind of training will poll workers receive in order to judge someone's identity based on their photo ID? This opens up a can of worms for possible profiling and other types of things.
Yeah, it's a really scary thought, and there isn't any type of standardized training that we see happening nationwide. When we talk about, being able to identify somebody from their ID, I think a lot of people forget sometimes how long you can have an ID. A lot of times you can have ID for up to 10 years. And one of my favorite stories is in the legislature a couple years ago when a voter ID bill was up. The senators passed around a photo and they were like, hey, can you tell us who this is? And no one could figure out who it was. Everyone was so confused. Wow. And what they had passed around was a driver's license photo of Senator Matt Hansen. And no one knew it was him, and they work with him every day. And so those are people you see every day. That's a coworker, and you couldn't recognize them from a driver's license photo. And we are just going to expect poll workers who they have training, but it's not like a year-round thing to be able to, within a couple weeks of training, be able to essentially do facial recognition. And I think it's a tall ask. I think it's something that a lot of poll workers have no interest in, and there's just not a good training standard set for it.
And it seems like a very heavy burden that will be placed on the poll workers as well as the voters when they arrive with this proposed ID that we're talking about. Can you talk some then about the voters and how it is most likely to have a problem acquiring that identification for those that right now are not required to have it? Those that live in poverty, those that live in marginalized communities, what is that going to do for those individuals?
So it's just going to make it hard, and really what it's going to do is make them not want to vote, because you're going to have to go, if you don't have your ID, you might not have a copy of your birth certificate with you. Getting a copy of your birth certificate costs money. You have to drive there, which costs money. Then you have to go to the DMV with those documents you just drove and paid for. You have to pay to drive some more and then get that done. And I can honestly say, for myself, the bigger thing that I think a lot of people don't consider is the importance of, in pretty much any strict voter ID bill we've seen, is that it has to be your current address on your driver's license if you have that as a form. So if you moved a month ago and didn't update your driver's license, that's going to be an issue. And I know I'm the type of person who I might not update my driver's license until I go in because I got to get a new picture taken. And now, instead of that not being an issue with me voting and participating in democracy, now that's a thing where it's like, okay, do I go pay this $25 now and get a new driver's license, or do I not vote? And I'm gonna vote, but when there's somebody who they're already down to that, last 20, $30, are they gonna wanna say, even if they have that driver's license, ooh, my last 20, $30, I wanna use that just to go vote? I hope everyone, if that's the situation that happens, makes that choice and decides to vote. But when it's between that and a meal for your kids, it's not really fair to ask people to do.
So the true impact of such an amendment would be to discourage voters and to place more hurdles in their ways, so maybe they won't even show up at the polls.
Yes, that's the true impact, and that's the true intent of it.
I've gotten the question, will you have to show identification when you get on a plane? And why not when I go to vote?
Well, when you're going to vote, that's a constitutional right. That's my number one thing, is we have a constitutional right to participate in our democracy. I think about my elders and the generations that came before me. There's people who have died for me to be able to vote. No one has died for me to be able to fly in a plane. That's just the case of it. So when I think about it, I think about my constitutional right, what my different ancestors have done for me to be in the place where I have the opportunity to vote, and that it's just a very different thing.
Can you tell us about the coalition opposing this voting rights restriction amendment and some of the steps that the coalition is taking to get the word out about the vagueness of the language and why this amendment should be opposed?
Yeah, definitely. We have a really awesome coalition with Civic, Legal Women Voters, some other amazing groups who are all coming together to really stand up and protect Nebraskan voters. And the big part of our initial effort is going to be educating people around the language and really digging into the costs, the complications, and the consequences of this voter restriction amendment. That's what we want everyone to know. We want people to know it's going to cost $3 million to start off and then $1 million to maintain. We want people to know how complicated it can make just the simple process of going to cast your vote and participating in our democracy, whether that's in person or by mail. And we want people to know the consequences, being that, you know, we're going to be turning away rural voters. We're going to be turning away Black and brown voters. We're going to be turning away elder voters. Like, anyone who really is not just, anyone who ever falls into the category of being disenfranchised, it just like doubles up on all the issues that they're going to face. So we want people to know those consequences. We want people to really take the time to think about that, because as we educate people about that, and all our different groups, all these trusted groups in the community, educate people on that, people are going to realize this is not something that they want to sign. This is not something they want to be a part of, and they will join us and help us defeat it.
This is feeling really kind of reminiscent, and maybe I'm aging myself when I say this. I don't necessarily remember it, but I remember the conversations about it. Some of the tactics that were used, like in a Jim Crow era, or when there were polls, taxes, or exams that you needed to take at the polling place. This voter ID is feeling very reminiscent of some of that and how it continues to disenfranchise voters. So I want to thank you and Civic Nebraska for being here today to discuss this very important issue for our voters. Can you tell us about what viewers can do to show their opposition to the amendment?
Well, I would say the biggest thing viewers can do is talk to their family, their friends, their neighbors, anyone in your community about this petition, why they should not sign it, explain to them the costs, complications, and consequences that come with it, and then reach out to Civic Nebraska, reach out to the Legal Women Voters, and get involved. We'll be there to help you get involved, to help us educate more people. There will be a lot of work coming up for whether it's doing calls, whether it's knocking doors, just really letting the community know that this is a bad idea, it's a bad policy, and it's dangerous.
Can you talk some about the Decline to Sign campaign, what that's all about, and how individuals can get involved with that campaign?
Definitely, yeah. So the Decline to Sign campaign is really all about letting people know there will be petition collectors out in our communities trying to get people to sign their signature to say, hey, I want voter ID, when we know that's not the case. And a lot of times, like you said, the language on different ballot initiatives can get confusing. Sometimes petition signature collectors can mislead people. So we want just people out in the community, when they see someone out there collecting signatures, also to be there to let them know, hey, this is exactly what you're signing. This is what it would do. These would be the costs associated with it. And to get involved with that, people can just reach out to Civic Nebraska.
Okay. And can you talk some specifically about Civic Nebraska and the role that the coalition has played, not just on this initiative, but several other initiatives, and how the coalition came together, and talk some about some of the things that are going on now, such as the march that will take place on Saturday to address this issue and other voting rights issues?
Definitely. So we have a great voting rights coalition here in Nebraska, and we've worked on a lot of different issues. Together, we've fought this battle against voter ID in the legislature for the past 10 years now, I think. And we also have other issues like the re-enfranchisement of returning citizens. So making sure that we're doing everything we can to get rid of the 2-year waiting period for folks with felony convictions to be able to vote. So it's a group that has mostly worked to combat bad bills in the legislature and to promote good bills like expanding vote by mail and things that would really help voters. And so we all, once we saw this ballot language get introduced, came together to just figure out what all we can do to be stopping this from going through. So we will be having a march this Saturday, which will go over the HR 1 and is it S1?
S1.
S1, yeah. And so just really promoting voting rights and making sure people understand the importance of their voting rights and getting them involved so that they're reaching out to their state legislators, their state senators, and their Congress people, just to make sure that everyone is taking the fight for voting rights as seriously as it needs to be taken. And also just to have a little bit of fun, because what's better than getting together with a group of people who love voting rights?
Absolutely. You mentioned the 2-year waiting period, and there's a huge contingency of individuals that will come back home to communities, not just in Nebraska, but across the country, that are disenfranchised. Some states even have a permanent disenfranchisement where you can never regain your voting rights. Talk a little bit about the status of the 2-year waiting period in Nebraska and what that looks like for returning citizens.
Yeah, so here in Nebraska, we have a 2-year waiting period that occurs after the end of your sentence. So once you're off, you finish your sentence, done with probation and parole, it's an additional 2 years. And Nebraska, last time I checked, we're either in the 3 or 4 most restrictive states. A lot of states have made a lot of progress in this area. And Nebraska, we're better than we used to be. We used to be a lifetime ban like you discussed. Now we are that 2-year waiting period. One of the biggest things with it being the 2-year waiting period now is that a lot of people, because it was a lifetime ban for so long, don't even realize that 2 years exists. They still think it's a lifetime ban. So a big piece of the work is educating people that it's no longer a lifetime ban. And then the other half of the work is really doing everything we can to get rid of just the fact that we ever take away anyone's voting rights, because the right to vote is something that too many people have fought and died for it to ever be taken away.
Absolutely. Brad, thank you so much for all the information you've given us today and for all the work that you do with Civic Nebraska. We really appreciate you and the coalition, the League of Women Voters, and others that are involved in this battle. So for over 101 years, the League of Women Voters have fought for a more inclusive democracy where voting rights are expanded and not restricted, as is proposed by this constitutional amendment. We are proud to be a member of the coalition with Nebraska Civic, and we want to make sure that we do all that we can to educate those voters about this language, about the drive that is going on to get individuals to sign on this petition and the detrimental impact it could have in Nebraska, the same way it has in some other states across the country. So I want to thank you again for being here with us to discuss this very important issue, Brad. And for the League of Women Voters, I'm Terri Crawford, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues and the candidates, and at election time, be sure you have the information, the necessary tools, and go out and vote. Thank you so much. Go vote Omaha.